Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Finest Hours, starring Chris Pine, Casey Affleck, Ben Foster, Holiday Granger, John Ortiz, Kyle Gallner, and Eric Bana, directed by Craig Gillespie. Now, I remember going to theaters for this thing, not remembering a thing about it, except for the ending. But let's get into the movie and see if it's this something like I remember big time. Let's get into it. It's November in the year 1951 in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, and we meet a Coast Guard named Bernie Weber, played by Chris Pine, and his friend Gus go out on a double date with Miriam, played by Holiday Granger, who I've seen in that recent Cinderella film, but she's more memorable here than she was there, I'll say. And her friend, and they're meeting for the first time, which is something that could happen in the 1950s. And they go out for a drink, and Miriam is afraid he wouldn't like her as much as. But these characters are alright in my book. Gus and his date suggest to go out on a boat, and Bernie goes to a few older gentlemen and asks to borrow a boat until Carl Nickerson babbles out about his sister, whom we've never met before, until later in the movie, of course. And they go out in a boat, which is a nice scene, and I'm liking their chemistry. We move on to February 1952, while at a dance, and Miriam asks Bernie rather too soon if he married her, and he says no at first, but after running for her and a talking to Miriam scene, Bernie accepts her proposal as he's a little nervous about getting married to someone whom they've first met for a few months. And she chooses to get married on April 16th of the year 1952, and he's supposed to ask for permission from his commanding officer, which doesn't make much sense in my opinion. And the shots were good, as I won't complain about the shots in the movie. We move on to the Pendleton, where we meet Ray Siebert, played by Casey Affleck, along with Captain Frank Furteau, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and Wallace Query, played by John Ortiz, as they get stranded in the middle of the ocean on their ship, and they get stuck on the storm for quite some time. And I do like these scenes as Casey Affleck turns in some good work here, like all the other actors do, while the storm is getting more and more dangerous. And that heck, I'm not sure if they'll survive it as the ship slowly sinks. And I was on the edge of my seat. Bernie is at the Coast Guard with Andy Fitzgerald, played by Kyle Gallner. And as Bernie tries to ask Daniel Clough, played by Eric Bana, for permission for Miriam in marriage, and he comes off a little jerky while he tells Bernie to put a crew together with him, and Richard Livesey, played by Ben Foster. And I enjoy being around these guys, except for Daniel. He comes off pretty jerky in my opinion. And the guys play around with Bernie and tell him he does need to get permission from Miriam, and Miriam calls him before he goes out to the storm. And the setup is good for the plot of this movie. While everyone at the Coast Guard says they can't do it because it's a suicide mission, which gives Bernie no choice but to get out there, and thanks to the storm, and no thanks to Daniel, and people are worried about Bernie for going out into the mission, while Gus goes with Bernie, and Richard is while Gus is sick with a cold. And I feel very bad for them for going into the storm like the way it is. While the score wasn't the most memorable thing about the movie, and Ray saves some lives by cutting the bow into pieces, and it wouldn't save everyone, and they would sink. And the best thing about the movie is the courage it has. Daniel gets Bernie out of there to save the ship with a few people, and who will that be? Richard, Andy, and Irvin Masquet. I don't know if I'm saying the name right, please forgive me. While Gus tries to go, but they tell him to stay back for sickness reasons, while the rest of them talk with Bernie and says it's a suicide mission, and they go anyways while Miriam calls the Coast Guard, and Bernie has to leave, but he doesn't pick up the phone, which is absolutely heartbreaking. While the ship is sinking slowly, the crew does everything they could, and Bernie takes the other three men getting on a bigger boat where the rescue begins. And these poor guys are brave to do it, and this is turning into a survival movie, which is something I'm a fan of. Miriam arrives to talk with Daniel, and Daniel doesn't listen quite well as she tries to send Bernie back to shore, and they were supposed to get married, and looking at the stormy weather is the most intense scene in the movie, in my opinion, as I was on the edge of my seat during this half of the movie. After the talk with Daniel, Miriam runs out and scared for Bernie and bumps her car into the snow, while Bernie is getting closer to the stormy weather, and while they'll find the sinking ship, which I'll get to in the next segment, while the storm is getting more and more intense and dangerous. The storm makes Bernie lose their compass while they are going from one bump of water to the next, and Bernie, Richard, Andy, and Irvin are freezing their booties off. Meanwhile, the ship sees a little sunlight from the storm, and they turn 30 degrees in the next 2 minutes, and a wave comes and makes their situation a little bit worse, and they hit the bottom of the lock and lock the ship, and from there to stop the engine running as Ray is worried about the ship and its crew, and Casey Affleck does a good job in the role. Miriam asks for help from a woman named Lorraine and a couple of kids over a tow truck, and she gets her brother to help Miriam getting her out of the snow. And Miriam wants to intensely hear the radio, and Lorraine advises Miriam to not hear it as much. And Carl, who's the brother of Lorraine, helps her tow her car, and she gets to the church to hear what's happening to them in the storm while Ray is trying to save the ship. And Bernie is still on the way to them, and they can hear the situation, but the station can't hear them, and he still keeps going, and after how far they are going, and he plans on finishing the job, and that's great courage. And Chris Pine does a good job at pulling courage off in this movie, as well as other movies in the other scenes. With Miriam made me feel some pity, and the scenes with Ray feel petrified for him as well as Bernie, and director Craig Gillespie does a good job at pulling intensity out of this movie. But at the same time, the movie is getting a little bit too long at 2 hours. It's almost 2 hours, and it's getting a little tedious after a while. Bernie puts on the searchlight and finds Ray and the ship and its crew, and they call out for help. And a few of them jump in the water, which seems like a bad idea. They grabbed them all, which made them so happy, and they all made it out alive, even Ray. But the question is, will they ever get home? And that's something I'm going to talk about in the next segment, as I worry about these guys quite a bit in this movie. And good job to director Craig Gillespie, as that's good storytelling in my opinion. Let's hear from him. They bring back the boat home while the ship sinks at the searchlight goes off for now, and Miriam hears from the church that the boat has 32 survivors, while Bernie continues to get home on his own and ignores Daniel, and the power goes out in the town, and Ray asks Bernie how did they find them without a compass, and will they ever get them to land. And Bernie shakes quite a bit because it's stinking freezing out there, and when hope is almost gone, the citizens of the town stop their cars on the shore to turn on the lights so the Coast Guard can see them. And Bernie barely sees it because of the fog, and as it turns out, they're not hallucinating because they do see the lights, and the searchlight goes on saying they're fine, and the townspeople sees them, and they witness a miracle where the 32 survivors, including Irvin, Andy, Richard, and Bernie, come to the shore and get them out, and Bernie is the last person out, and he's freezing to death. He sees Miriam and they kiss, they miss each other, and they get off the boat and they get married on April 16th of that year, 1952, and the climax was quite a miracle, as I was quite okay with it, to be honest. Now it's time for my rating. I'll give this movie a 6.3 out of 10. I was on the edge of my seat during the rescue mission, as the scenes in the sinking ship I do like, and the character, except for Daniel, as he comes off jerky in my opinion, and Bernie and Miriam's chemistry was quite good. The score wasn't the best thing about the movie, but what is the best thing about the movie is it has courage, and I'm a fan of survival stories, as this is what it is in the second half of the movie. The movie is at times intense, as I was hanging on the edge of my seat during the scenes, and it becomes sort of a survival story. And it is a fine time at the movies, despite it's a little long. But I recommend this movie to experience how intense storms are. And this movie is doing this the second half of the movie, I'll say. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me. And next time we'll be back with I, Tanya. And until then, adios.